There are some photographs that become impossible to look at the same way again. A smiling young woman standing beside a white van. Mountains rising behind her. A beautiful sunset. A road disappearing into the distance. At first glance, it looks like freedom, adventure, the beginning of a life filled with possibilities. But sometimes, you only understand a photograph after you know what happened next. In the summer of 2021, 22-year-old Gabby Petito was traveling across the United States with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. They were living out of a converted van, visiting national parks, exploring unfamiliar places, and documenting their journey online. From the outside, it looked like the kind of road trip many young people dream about. They had the van, they had the mountains, they had the open road, and Gabby had her camera. She photographed the places they visited and shared pieces of the journey with the world. But behind those photographs, something was going wrong. The relationship between Gabby and Brian had become increasingly troubled. There had been tension, arguments, and eventually an encounter with police in Utah that would become one of the most scrutinized moments in the entire case. At the time, however, no one knew how important that encounter would become. The officers didn't know that Gabby would soon disappear. Her family didn't know that the last messages they exchanged would become evidence. And the people watching Gabby's travel videos had no idea they were watching the final weeks of her life. Just weeks later, Gabby would vanish. Brian would return to Florida without her. Her family would report her missing, and an entire country would begin asking the same question: where is Gabby Petito? The answer would eventually be found in the Wyoming wilderness. But by then, Brian Laundrie would also be gone. What followed was a massive search, a nationwide manhunt, an FBI investigation, and a discovery that would finally establish what investigators believed had happened. But even after the criminal investigation ended, questions remained. Could something have been done differently? Could the warning signs have been recognized? And did the police encounter in Utah raise legal questions that still needed to be answered? Those questions eventually moved from the court of public opinion into an actual courtroom. And as of 2026, that legal battle is still part of Gabby's story. Gabby Petito was born and raised on Long Island, New York. She was 22 years old when she began the trip that would make her name known around the world. People who knew Gabby described someone who loved traveling and experiencing new places. She enjoyed photography. She loved sharing her experiences. And she had begun building a future with Brian Laundrie. The couple became engaged. They had plans for their lives together. And in the summer of 2021, they decided to take an extended road trip across the United States. Their white Ford Transit van became their home. Instead of staying in hotels every night, they planned to sleep in the van and travel from one destination to another. They wanted to see the country. They wanted to visit national parks. They wanted to experience places they had never seen before. For Gabby, the trip was more than simply a vacation. It was a chance to create memories, and she documented those memories. Her social media accounts showed photographs of mountains, deserts, trails, forests, and sunsets. She posed in front of scenic landscapes. She smiled for the camera. The van appeared in many of the photographs. The whole thing looked like an adventure, and that online record would later become incredibly important, because when Gabby disappeared, investigators didn't have to rely entirely on people's memories. They had photographs, videos, messages, phone records, surveillance footage, financial transactions, and witnesses who had crossed paths with the couple. Together, those pieces would help investigators reconstruct the final weeks of Gabby's life. But there was another side to the story. The reality of spending weeks traveling in a small van can be very different from the fantasy of a road trip. There is little privacy. Constant movement can be exhausting. Stress can build, and relationship problems don't disappear simply because two people are surrounded by beautiful scenery. According to investigators and later reporting, there were signs that Gabby and Brian's relationship had become strained. But there wasn't one dramatic public moment announcing that everything was falling apart. Instead, the warning signs appeared through smaller incidents, arguments, emotional distress, tension, and eventually, a call to police. That call came on August 12, 2021, in Moab, Utah. A witness contacted authorities after seeing an argument involving a young couple. The witness reported seeing a man strike a woman. Police eventually located the white van. They pulled it over, and what happened next was captured on police body camera footage. Gabby was visibly upset. She was crying. She spoke with officers about what had happened. Brian also spoke with police. The officers separated the two and tried to understand what had occurred. Gabby's account and Brian's account differed in important ways. The officers ultimately decided not to make an arrest. Instead, they separated the couple for the night. The encounter ended, and the two continued their journey. At that moment, there was no way for anyone involved to know how significant that decision would eventually become. The officers didn't know that Gabby would be found dead weeks later. They didn't know Brian would become the central figure in a nationwide investigation. They didn't know that millions of people would eventually watch the footage and analyze their every decision. They were dealing with the information they had at the time. But after Gabby's death, the police encounter was examined from an entirely different perspective. An independent review later identified mistakes in the officers' handling of the incident. Gabby's parents would eventually file a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Moab and the officers involved. Their argument was that the police response had failed to properly recognize and respond to the situation involving their daughter. The city disputed those allegations. And it is important to understand that the lawsuit was not claiming that the officers killed Gabby. The legal question was whether their conduct during that August 12 encounter created civil liability. That distinction would become extremely important later. But in August 2021, Gabby and Brian continued traveling. They spent time around the Salt Lake City area. They then moved toward Wyoming. Their plans included visiting Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone. The photographs continued. The scenery continued. The road trip appeared to continue. But investigators would later reconstruct those final days in extraordinary detail. They examined photographs. They reviewed surveillance footage. They looked at phone records. They spoke with witnesses. They tracked financial transactions. And they tried to determine exactly where Gabby had been and when. By late August, the couple had reached Wyoming. The landscape was dramatically different from the cities they had passed through. There were enormous mountains, long stretches of road, forests, rivers, and vast areas of wilderness. There were also places where cell phone service could be limited. Gabby continued communicating with her family. But eventually, something changed. The communications became unusual, and then they stopped. Her family became increasingly concerned. They didn't know what was happening. They didn't know that Brian was preparing to leave Wyoming. And they didn't know that the next time they would hear Gabby's name would be in connection with a nationwide missing person investigation. One of the most important pieces of evidence from this period came from an unexpected source. Another traveler had recorded video while driving through the Wyoming area. The footage wasn't created for a criminal investigation. It was simply travel footage. But after Gabby was reported missing, investigators examined it. The video appeared to contain the white van that Gabby and Brian had been traveling in. Suddenly, an ordinary piece of travel content had become potentially important evidence. That was one of the unusual things about the Gabby Petito case. The public became heavily involved in the search. People examined photographs. They reviewed videos. They compared locations. They searched for landmarks. They submitted tips, and investigators received thousands of pieces of information. But public involvement also created problems. Not every theory was evidence. Not every person appearing in a photograph was suspicious. Not every strange detail had a criminal explanation. Investigators had to separate useful information from speculation, and that would become one of the defining challenges of the case. The final confirmed period of Gabby's life was centered around the Jackson, Wyoming area and the surrounding national park region. There were sightings, photographs, surveillance footage, witness accounts, and eventually the couple traveled toward the Spread Creek area of the Bridger-Teton National Forest. The area was remote, beautiful, and enormous. This wasn't a neighborhood where cameras covered every street. It was wilderness, and that fact would become extremely important. Because when investigators eventually searched for Gabby, they had to cover a huge area. On September 1, Brian returned to Florida, but Gabby wasn't with him. He drove the van back to his family's home in Northport. That single fact would transform the investigation. Gabby's family still believed she was somewhere on the road trip. They didn't know that Brian had already returned home. And they certainly didn't know what had happened in Wyoming. For days, Gabby's family tried to contact her. At first, there could have been ordinary explanations. Maybe her phone was dead. Maybe she was somewhere without service. Maybe she was busy. But eventually, those explanations stopped making sense. The communication wasn't normal. And on September 11th, Gabby's family reported her missing. The case immediately attracted national attention. Her photographs were everywhere. The white van became recognizable. Brian's return to Florida became major news, and the seemingly carefree road trip was suddenly being examined through a completely different lens. Every photograph mattered. Every message mattered. Every location mattered. And every hour mattered. The search for Gabby had begun. Authorities began reconstructing her final movements. Investigators examined the van. They reviewed digital communications. They spoke with witnesses, and search teams began focusing on Wyoming. The Spread Creek area became one of the primary locations of interest. The landscape presented enormous challenges. Search teams had to move through wilderness. They examined roads and trails. They searched areas where someone could be difficult to find. Aircraft were used. Dogs were brought in. And volunteers participated. Meanwhile, the public watched. News organizations reported developments constantly. Social media users followed every new piece of information. And Gabby's family waited. Then, on September 19th, investigators made the discovery everyone had feared. Human remains were found in the Bridger-Teton National Forest. The location was secured. Investigators collected evidence. Forensic identification was conducted, and Gabby's family was notified. Gabby had been found, but she was dead. The missing person investigation had become a homicide investigation. The Teton County coroner determined that Gabby's death was a homicide. Investigators now had to answer the most important question: who was responsible? And their attention immediately turned toward Brian. But Brian was already in Florida, and investigators wanted to speak with him. The situation changed rapidly. Police surrounded the Laundrie family home. News crews gathered outside. The public demanded answers. But Brian did not give investigators the explanation they were looking for. His family retained an attorney. And then another extraordinary development occurred. Brian disappeared. His parents reported that they had last seen him earlier that month. Investigators discovered his Ford Mustang in the Myakkahatchee Creek Environmental Park area. The vehicle was connected to Brian. Search teams began examining the area. Now there were effectively two searches. One search had been for Gabby. Now another was for Brian. The FBI and local authorities began searching the Florida wilderness. The area was difficult. Water levels complicated the search. Some portions were inaccessible. The search continued for weeks. Meanwhile, rumors spread across the internet. People claimed to have seen Brian. Others said they knew where he was. Photographs were analyzed. Videos were examined. Tips poured in. Some were useful. Others were false leads. Investigators had to work through an enormous amount of information. Then, in October 2021, the search changed again. Investigators returned to the area where Brian's vehicle had been found. Personal belongings were located. The search continued, and human remains were eventually discovered. The remains were later identified as Brian Laundrie. The man investigators wanted to question was dead. An autopsy determined that Brian had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But investigators also found something else: a notebook. That notebook would become one of the final pieces of the case. In January 2022, the FBI released its final investigative update. The agency said investigators had found written statements in Brian's notebook in which he admitted responsibility for Gabby's death. The FBI concluded that Brian was responsible. It also stated that investigators did not identify anyone else directly involved in Gabby's death. There would be no murder trial, no jury, no courtroom confrontation, no opportunity for prosecutors to present the evidence against Brian before a jury, and no opportunity for Brian to offer a defense. The person investigators identified as responsible was already dead, but the investigation had produced other important evidence. The FBI examined communications between Brian's phone and Gabby's phone. Investigators concluded that messages were sent after Gabby's death in a way that appeared designed to make it seem as though she was still alive. That was significant because it suggested an attempt to create a false impression about Gabby's whereabouts. Investigators also examined financial records. The FBI determined that Brian used Gabby's debit card after her death. That became the basis for the federal arrest warrant issued during the manhunt. Again, that warrant wasn't a murder charge, but it provided investigators with a separate federal offense connected to Brian's actions. The digital trail was extensive: phone records, financial records, photographs, videos, surveillance footage, vehicle movements. All of these pieces helped investigators reconstruct what happened, and the white van became one of the most important objects in the investigation. To Gabby, it had represented freedom. It had been her home during the road trip, but to investigators, it became evidence. They examined where it had been, who had access to it, and what information could be recovered from it. The road trip itself created a trail: gas stations, restaurants, campgrounds, national parks, parking lots, stores. Every location potentially left behind some kind of record: a receipt, a camera, a photograph, a witness, a phone connection. Investigators could follow those traces backward, from Florida to Wyoming, and then through the final days of Gabby's life. The August 27 timeline became particularly important. Gabby and Brian were in Wyoming. They had been traveling around the Grand Teton area. There were witnesses. There were photographs. There was surveillance footage. And eventually, they moved toward Spread Creek. That same area would later become the place where Gabby's remains were found. The photographs from Gabby's final days are particularly difficult to look at now because of what we know. At the time, they were ordinary travel photographs. But once the disappearance became public, people began looking at them differently. That's one of the dangers of hindsight. We know the ending. So we go backward and reinterpret everything. A smile suddenly looks like a warning. A quiet photograph suddenly feels ominous. A normal moment begins to seem significant. But investigators cannot operate purely on emotion. They have to ask what the evidence actually proves. Where was the photograph taken? When? Who was there? What does it establish? And what does it not establish? That distinction matters. Because a compelling story is not necessarily the same thing as a proven fact. The police body camera footage from August 12 became one of the most watched pieces of evidence in the case. Millions of people saw Gabby crying. They saw Brian talking to officers. They heard the officers discussing what they believed had happened. And because viewers already knew the ending, they watched the footage differently. They knew Gabby would be dead weeks later. The officers didn't. That difference is crucial. Investigators and courts have to evaluate the encounter based on what the officers knew at the time. What did the witness report? What did Gabby say? What did Brian say? What did the officers observe? What did the law require? And what options did they have? Those questions are more complicated than simply asking whether the officers should have known what was going to happen. After Gabby's death, an independent review examined the response. The review identified mistakes in the officers' handling of the incident. The department implemented changes and additional training. But Gabby's parents believed the matter needed to go further. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city of Moab and the officers involved. The family alleged that the officers failed to properly respond to the domestic violence situation. The city disputed the claims, and in November 2024, a Utah judge dismissed the lawsuit. The decision centered on governmental immunity. That did not mean the court had ruled that the police response was perfect. It meant the court concluded that governmental immunity protections prevented the family's claims from proceeding as filed. The Petito family appealed, and that appeal eventually brought the case before the Utah Supreme Court. This is where the story reaches its latest chapter. As of 2026, the criminal investigation is closed. The FBI's conclusion remains that Brian Laundrie was responsible for Gabby's death and that no other person was directly involved. But the civil lawsuit is different. The Utah Supreme Court is examining whether the family's claims against the government can proceed under Utah law. Oral arguments were scheduled for March 2026, and the case remained pending as of the latest reports. The court isn't deciding whether Brian killed Gabby. That question has already been answered by the FBI investigation. The court is dealing with a different question. Can a government entity be held legally responsible for the actions or alleged failures of police officers who encountered Gabby before her death? The family argues that officers should have recognized the situation differently. They argue that Gabby should have been treated as the victim. They argue that the response failed to adequately protect her. The city argues that the officers responded based on the information available to them and that the government cannot legally be held responsible for a murder committed later by another person. Those are very different arguments, and the court must decide how Utah law applies to the facts. This is why the legal case should not be presented as proof that police caused Gabby's death. That has not been established. The criminal investigation identified Brian as responsible. The civil lawsuit is about alleged negligence and legal accountability. And that distinction is important because one of the biggest questions people continue to ask is the question of hindsight. What if the August 12 encounter had gone differently? What if the police had arrested Brian? What if the couple had been separated for longer? What if someone had recognized the warning signs? What if Gabby's family had become concerned sooner? What if investigators had found her earlier? These questions are natural. But history doesn't provide alternate timelines. We know what happened. We know that police encountered Gabby and Brian in Utah. We know that they separated them temporarily. We know that Gabby later disappeared. We know Brian returned to Florida. We know Gabby's remains were found in Wyoming. We know Brian disappeared. We know his remains were later found in Florida. We know the FBI concluded that Brian was responsible. And we know that a written statement was found near his remains in which he claimed responsibility. Everything beyond those facts must be evaluated carefully. That's one of the most important lessons from this case. Hindsight can make everything seem obvious. Once you know the ending, every earlier moment can look like a warning. But people living through those moments didn't have the ending. They had incomplete information. That doesn't mean mistakes shouldn't be examined. They should. It means those mistakes have to be examined honestly. The purpose of reviewing a tragedy isn't simply to find someone to blame. It's also to understand how systems can improve. If police procedures need to change, they can change. If training needs to improve, it can improve. If domestic violence responses need to be strengthened, they can be strengthened. And hopefully, someone else can be protected. Gabby's case also changed the way millions of people looked at missing person investigations. It demonstrated how powerful digital evidence can be. A travel video became potentially important evidence. Photographs helped establish locations. Phone records helped establish movements. Financial records helped establish activity. And social media helped spread Gabby's story around the world. But the case also demonstrated the danger of online investigations. The internet can help, but it can also create rumors. People can become suspects simply because they appeared somewhere in a photograph. A theory can be repeated so many times that it begins to sound like a fact. And a person can be accused without evidence. That's why responsible true crime storytelling matters. Evidence has to come first. Gabby's parents understood the power of visibility. After her death, they created the Gabby Petito Foundation. The organization has worked on issues involving missing persons and domestic violence. Her family has continued advocating for changes that they believe could help other families. And that may become one of the most important parts of Gabby's legacy. Not the headlines, not the speculation, not the internet theories, but the effort to help someone else. Because there are countless missing people whose stories never receive the attention Gabby's case received. Families search. Families print flyers. Families contact authorities. Families wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for years. Gabby's case showed what can happen when an enormous audience becomes focused on one disappearance. But it also reminds us that every missing person deserves to be taken seriously. Every family deserves answers. And every victim deserves to be remembered as more than a headline. That's perhaps the hardest part of telling a story like this. Gabby didn't become a person because millions of people knew her name. She was already a person. She was someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's friend. She had hopes. She had plans. She wanted to travel. She wanted to photograph beautiful places. She wanted to experience the world. And she had no idea that millions of strangers would one day know her name because of the way her life ended. When we look back at her photographs now, it's easy to see only the tragedy. But those photographs were originally about life. They were about travel, about adventure, about seeing something new, about being young and believing there was still so much time ahead. That's how Gabby should be remembered. Not simply as the victim at the center of a famous true crime case, but as a young woman who had a life before the headlines. The criminal investigation eventually gave the public an answer about responsibility. The FBI concluded that Brian Laundrie was responsible for Gabby's death. The notebook provided investigators with a written statement claiming responsibility. And the FBI said it found no evidence that another person was directly involved. But the civil questions surrounding the August 12 police encounter remain. As of 2026, Gabby's family is still pursuing its legal challenge. And whatever the Utah Supreme Court ultimately decides, it will not change the FBI's conclusion about who killed Gabby. Instead, it will answer a different question: whether the government can be held legally responsible for the alleged failures of the officers who encountered her before her death. That question now belongs to the courts. Maybe that's the most important thing to understand about this case. Justice isn't always one single event. Sometimes justice is an investigation. Sometimes it's evidence. Sometimes it's a courtroom. Sometimes it's a policy that changes. Sometimes it's a law that gets reconsidered. And sometimes it's a family refusing to let their loved one's name disappear. Gabby's story began with a road trip, a white van, a young couple, a camera, a dream of seeing America. It ended with a search through the Wyoming wilderness, a nationwide manhunt, an FBI investigation, and a legal battle that continues years later. But the story shouldn't end with the last headline, because Gabby was never just a headline. She was a person. And remembering that may be the most important part of telling her story. If you're watching this on The Final Clue, remember that true crime isn't only about the person responsible. It's about the people whose lives were changed forever. It's about the evidence. It's about the unanswered questions. And it's about remembering the victims as people rather than simply names in a case file. Gabby Petito was 22 years old. She had a family who loved her. She had friends who remembered her. She had dreams she never got to finish. And she had a life that deserved to be remembered for more than the tragedy that ended it. The road trip was supposed to be an adventure. Instead, it became a story that would change how millions of people viewed missing person cases, domestic violence, social media, and the responsibility of those who are supposed to protect vulnerable people. And even years later, the questions surrounding that story continue. Who knew what? When did they know it? Could something have been different? And what does justice look like when the person responsible is no longer alive to face a courtroom? Those questions don't have simple answers. But Gabby's story continues to remind us why they matter. Because sometimes the most important part of a case isn't finding another theory. It's understanding the facts we already have. It's learning from what happened. And making sure the next family doesn't have to experience the same tragedy. Gabby's life was bigger than the investigation that followed it. Bigger than the headlines. Bigger than the photographs that became evidence. And bigger than the questions that remain. She was a young woman who wanted to see the world. And for a brief time, she did. She traveled across America. She stood beneath the mountains. She watched sunsets. She took photographs. She made memories. And although her journey ended in tragedy, the people who loved her have continued carrying her story forward. That may ultimately be her legacy. Not simply that the world remembers how she died, but that the world remembers that she lived, and that behind every missing person poster, every case file, every photograph, and every headline is a real human being whose life mattered. This was the story of Gabby Petito. And this is why, even years later, people still remember her name. If this documentary helped you understand the case beyond the headlines, consider subscribing to The Final Clue for more carefully researched true crime documentaries. And remember, behind every case file is a real person. Behind every headline is a family. And behind every mystery, there is a life that mattered.